My name's Andy Fisher. I'm the director of EcoFarm, and I wanted to welcome you all today's keynote with Ricardo Salvador. And we're thrilled to have him, and we are very excited to be talking about the 21st century food system we deserve. So with that, I want to do a few things. First, I want to thank our sponsors. There's a slide up here. You can see them all: Farmer and Cook, Full Belly Farm, Heart and Soil Magazine, CCOF, Stubsky Foundation, Veritable Vegetable, and Driscoll's, among many others. And I also wanted to show a very quick video that we filmed actually yesterday with our Golden Pliers Award, which is the award that staff gives out to the top volunteer of the year, somebody who's really contributed a lot of time and energy over the years. And I will put that on right now, and then we'll get going. Okay, thank you.
Hi, welcome to the Golden Pliers Award. This year it gives me great pleasure to give our award to this lovely lady, Miss Gail Ross. In 1978, Gail learned that there was such a brilliant thing as organically grown food. She became curious about how the food was grown, who was growing it, how it got from the field to her dinner plate. Luckily, her need to have work blended well with her organic food interest and found many jobs encircling food with making lifelong friends and a right livelihood. Starting with working outside, planting, weeding, and watering, and then moving on to warehousing, driving forklifts, and truckfuls of produce to work in an office building, bookkeeping for farmers and nonprofits, including the Ecological Farming Association. Gail's worked with us from 2004 to 2009 and continues to be one of our most valued friends and volunteer. She volunteers at the conference because, as Gail says, it's one of her favorite places to be. So with that, it is my great honor and privilege to give Gail Ross the 2022 Golden Pliers Award.
This is the one that's a surprise, right? Well, thank you. And when you first told me that I was going to get it, I thought maybe I didn't deserve it because I didn't do anything grand. And then I reconsidered and I thought, really, in this day and age, is any action that's helpful too small? No, I don't think so. Bigger is better and small is beautiful. And I really want to thank EcoFarms for providing some common ground for people to collaborate and work for the common good. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
So congratulations, Gail, on a well-deserved honor. And we're going to move on to our keynote. Alexa Delwich is going to introduce keynote, and Alexa is the director of the Center for Good Food Purchasing in Berkeley, and which I believe is just one of the most incredible organizing efforts around the country, in which they're bringing together labor, environmental groups, anti-hunger groups, and food groups towards buying food, towards convincing municipalities and school districts to be purchasing food with values, food that's based on good nutrition and has labor standards and environmental standards as well. So Alexa, it's all yours.
Thanks, Andy. And good morning and afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and my absolute honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Ricardo Salvador. And I know Ricardo needs no introduction to this crowd, but he does deserve a few minutes of recognition for his tireless leadership as the brains, heart, and moral compass of the food movement. Ricardo is on the board of the Center for Good Food Purchasing, so I've had the privilege of working with him and learning from him in that capacity for several years now. And I think what makes Ricardo such a special leader is that everything Ricardo does, every brilliant contribution that he makes, and there are too many to list, everything is guided by love, justice, and hope. and he breaks down complexity. He boils it down to what matters, the people who are most impacted and why. And regardless of who you are, how many years of experience you have or degrees you hold, he invites you in and he treats you as an equal. And he challenges you to be part of something bigger than you could have possibly imagined. That's certainly been true for me. And I know I'm just one of the many thousands of lucky people whose lives he's touched. And in this, era of virtual gatherings, when, at least for me, it feels pretty challenging to feel connected to humans, I wanted to share one personal example. So back in December of 2020, I got a text message very late one night from my dad, who was sharing with me a must-read op-ed from the New York Times. And the title of the piece was "Goodbye USDA, Hello Department of Food and Wellbeing." And it was written by Ricardo, along with Mark Bittman. And the next day I called up my dad and I said, "Hey, Dad, I actually know Ricardo. He's on my board. I get to work with him." And as we were talking all about the piece, I could tell that something clicked for him. In 1,000 words or less, Ricardo communicated ideas that I'd been trying to explain to my family for 20 years. My dad finally understood this work, and he was so proud. And my father, another important role model and inspiration for me, passed away a few months later. And that was one of the last times I spoke with him at length about this work of food systems transformation that we're all so passionate about. So Ricardo will always hold a very special place in my heart for giving me that memory and gift. And Ricardo, you've given the world and each of us in this room so many gifts. Thank you for the limitless energy and time that you've invested, ideas you've catalyzed and shaped, students and emerging leaders you've inspired, and systems you have shifted and shattered to make this world more equitable and just. And with that, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much for that, Alexa. It's almost difficult to continue after hearing something like that, and particularly hearing that from somebody that I really respect and have learned a great deal from. So I really thank you. I also want to thank Andy and all of the team at EcoFarm for the honor of inviting me to speak to this group. I'll tell you in just a little bit why I think it's a real special, unique opportunity for me to be able to speak to the audience at EcoFarm. And also, of course, want to thank the sponsors that are making all of this possible. So I'd like to start out by sharing that when I refer to the 21st century food system that we deserve, I'm thinking of this two different ways. I'm thinking that, first of all, we know how to put together food systems better than the one that we have right now. And the other sense is that the food system is a creation, at least in the United States, that would not exist without massive public investment. And that public investment, as that term connotes, basically has to do with how our tax dollars are used. And so we should expect that public money should yield primarily public good. So it's in those two senses that we need a different food system, one that we truly deserve, in the place of the system that we're all experiencing. And I'm going to detail this. Now, the reason why I think we don't have that food system has to do with a couple of factors. And so I'll quote one of my favorite scientists. Some of you may recognize E.O. Wilson, a sociobiologist at Harvard, who just unfortunately recently passed away. But he had this observation about the times in which we live, that the real problem of humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I will say a little bit more about this in just a few minutes, but I particularly want to emphasize that last part. Our conception of agriculture, of course, has evolved together with our learning about agriculture. As all of you who come to EcoFarm know, as a species, we're just rank beginners in terms of learning about agriculture. We've been around about 300,000 years as Homo sapiens, but we've only been performing agriculture for about 10,000 of those 300,000 years, and there's a lot that we have to learn still. But the conceptions that we have at the moment most recently were shaped by a series of revolutions that are only about 250 to 300 years old. And those 250 to 300-year-old ideas are the ideas that we're applying 21st century technology to. So they're antiquated notions of the planet, and yet we're applying very high-level technology and attempting to make them work, and it's creating difficulties. And again, I'll give you actual examples of that in just a little bit. The second premise that's going to run through all of this is something that I've already shared, and that has to do with the nature of investing public dollars. Among social scientists, there's a well-known nostrum, which is that the less inequality there is in a society, the better off the entire society is. And here's one illustration from a book that's called The Spirit Level, which summarizes research of many years done by British researchers, Wilson and Pickett. They looked at inequality among the nations of the world, but I'm showing you that they also did an analysis of the states in this nation. And in essence, what they found when they compared an index that describes health and social problems, things such as poverty, hunger, illiteracy, shortened lifespans, those sorts of things. When they compare an index that compiled all of those indicators of social problems against income, what they found was the lower the difference in income inequality, then the better off the entire society was at the level of states. And this conformed with what they observed at the level of the entire planet when they looked at countries where there is low social income inequality, regardless of what their total wealth is. So to give you an example, comparing Costa Rica, which is a country that is poor compared to the Nordic countries, where income inequality is also low, what they found that they were actually comparable in terms of social well-being because income inequality is low. It's about the same in both of those countries. So that's a principle that's going to run through some of the ideas that I'm going to share with you. So I promised you that I'd say a little bit more about why it's a big honor for me to speak to the crowd at EcoFarm. And the reason is, first of all, that you're dreamers. So together we can imagine the kind of 21st century food system that we want. But you're more than just dreamers. At EcoFarm, you're actually doing as well. So you're not just content to blue sky, you're actually working hard to put together what would be better than what we have right now. So I'm going to look forward to your thoughts, to your reactions, to your recommendations, to your corrections to what we discussed here over the next hour. Now, it's customary when you're recommending something that's better than what we have right now to go through the long litany of everything that's wrong. And I'm going to spare you all of that. You're all experts in the food system. You know this. You don't need to hear it one more time. Instead, I'm just going to tell you 6 reforms that I think are actionable and that need to work together in order to create the 21st century food system that we all deserve. Let me just show them to you right at the beginning. In case you fall asleep on me, at least you will have heard what they are. So first of all, one of the key things about a food system that at least I would define as acceptable is that we need to get past the notion of saying this is the most affordable, the best, the most advanced, the most efficient food system. Oh, and by the way, 12% of people are hungry. That's an unacceptable feature of a food system. That's a failure of a food system and a failure of the society that puts up with it. So that's one feature we need to work on. We also need to work on creating the reality that whenever we get hungry 3 times a day and we reach out to deal with that hunger, the default food that we all should have access to should be the food that is good for us, the food that nourishes us, the food that makes us live longer, prosperous, and fruitful lives. Thirdly, this is food that, as the pandemic has taught us, should be produced in regional food webs. Fourthly, it should be produced in a way that doesn't degrade the natural capital on which we all depend. Fifthly, it should be food that doesn't exploit people. And these last 2 categories we can summarize in the case of agroecological production as food that's produced by not exploiting nature. And then this 5th category, food that's produced by not exploiting people. And then lastly, in this era, it is abundantly clear that we know better than what we are doing in terms of practicing agriculture in a way that's climate positive, that does not contribute to greenhouse warming emissions, but rather captures carbon long-term and permanently. So this is what we're aiming for. So let me get started on some thinking about this. And a lot of this is going to be tied to the moment in which we're living. Just before we got started, Andy and the EcoFarm team shared that this is going to be archived on video. And unfortunately, a lot of this, I think, is going to be obsolete with time. Hopefully so, because hopefully we'll be living in better times. But at the moment, it's not really clear whether we're at the end of a pandemic, but we've been living through a pandemic that has essentially pulled back the curtain on a lot of the fragilities and the vulnerabilities of our society. And we've been doing that for the past 2 years. And as you know, one of the features is that the food system has actually been exposed, particularly the very tightly coupled linear model where massive amounts of food are produced in one concentrated area and then transported to other areas. And so you see here what has happened with the food cost index. These are data that are released every month on the 25th of every month by the USDA. So these are the latest figures. You see here the percentage increase in the cost of food. And the very last one here is the year-to-date estimate, since we're not yet through with the year 2022. Actually, USDA economists had predicted that this year food prices would begin to decline. But as I've described to you, these latest figures were released on the 25th of last month, the day after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has further dislocated industrial systems throughout the planet. And one of those industrial systems is the food system. So the next estimate that they're going to be, I think, is going to show a revision to that estimation that food prices would decline in 2022. But here's the reality. So as you all know, as experts in agriculture and the food system, we don't have hunger because there is insufficient production. We have hunger because of the fact that the food production system is not a philanthropy. So in other words, you don't get to eat just because you're hungry. You only get to eat if you have the resources to pay what it costs to produce, process, and distribute that food. And so we live in a society where not everybody can meet that standard. And furthermore, the ironic thing is that as all of you in California are particularly conscious of, some of the people who are essential to make that global food system operate are the very people who don't earn enough to be able to put healthy food on their own tables. So that's a feature of our own society, the exploitation of people that actually results in creating hunger through the food system. It's a perverse outcome, but it's an undeniable outcome for everybody that's familiar with the way that the food system works. Now, just so that you have a context, the USDA also reports in their food inflation calculations the 20-year historical average, and food costs have increased historically, ever since the USDA has been recording these since the 1920s. So food prices consistently increased, but here's the 20-year historical average at a little less than 2.5%. So essentially what we're seeing here is completely off the scale. So that's going to have repercussions in terms of hunger. Now, remember, what we're aiming for is not just to document what's wrong, but to think about how we can overcome that and create a better system. So let's go to root causes. The root cause of economic inequality basically has to do with the fact that there are some of us on the planet that have mythologies that justify why we're better and we're more entitled and deserve more than others. And this is a feature of human existence. It's a feature of human societies. And so the way that this manifests in the United States is that a lot of the structure of society still resembles not just medieval society, where there are folks that do the hard work in the trenches, actually interfacing with the planet, with the earth, with its biological systems in order to produce our food, and others don't have any idea what it takes to do that and basically just enjoy the outcome. We actually still embody the values of some of the very first large nation states, where, as you know, if you remember your sociology and your anthropology, the hallmark of developing social complexity was specialization. And I'm sure you'll remember, possibly even from grade school, this description of that hierarchy of specializations that creates what's archaeologists and economists refer to as surplus production, that allows people at the top of the social pyramid to really benefit from that social inequality. And if by chance you think that this is a feature of the remote past, here's a snapshot of economic hierarchy in the United States at present. You can see there the bottom 50% own 1% of the wealth, and you can compare that with the top of the social hierarchy. And to give you specific figures here, just so that you can comprehend the vast gap between the top and the bottom, essentially the top 1% hold as much wealth as the bottom 90%. This is US society. If that's not a social pyramid, I don't know what is. So this is the root cause. Now, you might think, if this is how we're going to deal with hunger, to undo that, then we've got a big task ahead of us. And I agree, that's a task that we should pursue. I'm going to recommend actually an intermediate task. It's going to be sufficiently difficult, but at least we have a stepping stone to get to it. And in order to understand what I'm going to recommend, let me just give you a further gloss on the issue of hunger. In the United States, you all are accustomed to the brag that the system is ostensibly so productive and so efficient that people in the United States on average only have to spend 10% of their disposable income to feed themselves. So let's mark that. You have two axes here. On the right-hand side, you have the share of income that we spend on our food. This is share of disposable income. On the left-hand axis, you have the actual dollars that represents. And what we're going to do is compare what this looks like for quintiles in our society. So 20% chunks of our society in terms of income that we earn. So let me show you what that looks like, just a snapshot. And then let's focus on the two extremes in order to derive a lesson. So let's take a look at the lowest percentile here. So you can see there, if you look at the green bar, that essentially what that quintile is spending on average is a little bit over $4,000 in order to feed their family. The reference family for this is 4 people, 2 adults, 2 children. But that is over 35% of the share of what that lowest income quintile actually earns. So just so that you have an idea and can compare, that's comparable to the national average in a country like Zambia. So embedded within the United States, you have folks that are living that reality. And as I mentioned, some of these folks are the folks that harvest, process, and prepare the very food that we're talking about. So compare that to the other extreme. So in the highest quintile, if you take a look at the green bar again, you see that those folks are spending 3.5 times what the folks in the lowest quintile spend on their food, about $14,000. But because they're wealthy, they're barely spending 8% of their total net income on food. So when we brag on that figure of spending only 10%, it's not only that it's an average, the brag doesn't actually capture the appropriate arithmetic. The brag is not that the numerator is small. In other words, that the cost of food is small. The cost of food in the United States is stratospheric. And as I've mentioned to you, it increases every year. The quotient, that percentage, is small because the numerator is huge. The United States is an extremely wealthy country. And that highest quintile that you see there is just one illustration of that. So you may say you're not yet seeing how this is easier than dealing with the root cause of hierarchy in society to try to make us a less equal society. A less unequal society. I'm going to make it even more complicated for you. I'm going to show you a short video that is produced by the Rockefeller Foundation, which just a few months ago produced a report where they estimated the true cost of food. An EcoFarm crowd knows exactly what this concept is, and particularly since a large proportion of you actually produces food, you know that you don't get paid the fair price for everything that goes into producing that food, and that's not even the entire story. So let's watch this.
You think you know how much our food costs? Think again. When we buy food, we pay for much more than just the fruit on the tree. Costs for labor, transportation, processing, and production all go into that price. That number is just a slice of the true cost of food. Consider everything we don't pay for at the checkout line. Impacts on the environment, underpaid labor, benefits for farm workers, the cost of diet-related disease. Those things add up. Altogether, the true cost of food is estimated to be at least 3 times what we currently pay. But don't think we're getting a good deal here. We're actually getting squeezed. Society pays that balance, not out of our pockets, but through other means, like rising healthcare costs, effects of climate change, and food workers who are often underpaid and undervalued. This is the true cost of food, and often marginalized communities pay the biggest share. Here's some good news. Understanding these additional costs can help us make better decisions, not just about what we grow and eat, but about the systems and policies that affect what ends up on our plate every single day.
So you see the URL there if you want to go and find this for yourself. And so now that we've laid all of this out, it may just seem like an impossibility to really deal with this, because now we end up not only with the fact that we have rampant social hierarchy and economic inequality, and that the price of food is high and increasing. Now we learn that if we really paid what it costs to produce that food, in other words, if you're farmers, if we really deal with paying fair wages to the people that work for us, namely, so that they can afford not only food, but dignified living, and if they could aspire to the same sorts of benefits that all the rest of us are accustomed to assuming are just our natural right as workers, if we're white-collar workers, and if we internalize the cost of the environmental impact of agriculture and so on down the line, it turns out food really should cost 3 times as much as what we're paying right now. So here we have a conundrum. How are we going to deal with this conundrum? I told you at the beginning that I explained a little bit more about E.O. Wilson's idea about the fact that we operate on antiquated ideas with godlike technology. So when we develop our contemporary notion of agriculture, there were essentially about 1/7 of us on this planet. So the impact that we were making on the planet was very, very small compared to the undeniable impact that we're making now. At that time, it did seem reasonable that you literally could send your waste down the river and not have to worry about. The buffering capacity of the environment to absorb our waste was enormous. So costing that out at that time would have been just an undefined concept. And at the time that our modern conception of agriculture developed, we still enslaved people to provide the brutal labor that was required for extensive agriculture. So we kept those costs off the book. And it isn't, those of you that are familiar with our modern agricultural system, it isn't as if we've really remedied that by paying the fair price of labor in order to produce food. And so we end up with a situation where it's almost an impossible conundrum to solve, to say, we're going to deal with this by making sure that everybody earns a sufficient income to lead a dignified life. Now, there are many groups, and possibly many of you are part of these groups that are working for improved wages so that we end up with a society where everybody can afford the true cost of food. But remember, the true cost of food we now know conservatively is 3 times what we're paying right now. In other words, 30% of our disposable income would be going to pay for our food if we were paying the actual costs. So obviously, we're not going to be able to increase income in any reasonable amount of time and without major opposition in order to deal with it through that route. But here's a route, and many people have been working on this. It is the concept that is known as the right to food. And this is a concept that's embodied actually in the United Nations Human Rights Accord. And many nations have actually signed on to this. And so the United States is notoriously not a signatory to this document. This is a different conversation. We won't get into it here, but here you see a description that gives you a little bit more detail about how the folks that work on food commons and the right to food think about it. the way that I would synthesize this is that the folks that work on this idea and this human right do so on the premise that whether you have access to a nourishing food supply that then makes it possible to take advantage of every other feature of modern life, take full advantage of your education, to take full advantage of professional opportunities and so on. If you are not well nourished, then those are not realities for you. Well, folks working on this essentially take it as an axiom that it should not be left up to the vicissitudes of who you are, where you were born, where you came into this planet, what your home neighborhood was. No matter who you are, when you come into the planet, you should count on having a right to food. So as you see described here, this means the ability to quantitatively and qualitatively have adequate and sufficient food that corresponds to your cultural traditions, to the place where you are, and which ensures physical and mental and individual and collective fulfilling and dignified life free of fear. So who pays for this? If this is a human right, then this is a social cost. If we insist on living in a society where we're going to put up with the degree of hierarchy and economic inequality that I've just described, then we need to recognize that we need to pay the actual costs for that in some way or another. So let me give you an example that shows that we know how to do this already. And this comes from a publication that is just a few days old. This was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association just on Monday. And here are the findings. Essentially, what these researchers at Stanford have noticed that the pandemic period has taught us is that we put into place government programs to prevent massive immiseration across society. So child poverty was reduced by almost 41%. And the actions that it took to do that, remember, this is pre-pandemic to the pandemic period. The actions that it took were, first of all, a child tax credit that provided actual cash to families that went to buy necessities for the family. 3 stimulus checks, a moratorium on evictions so people didn't find themselves on the street and homeless, even though they weren't earning money and could not cover rent, increased unemployment benefits, and an increase in SNAP benefits and housing assistance. All of these were social investments, our tax dollars, being applied on the logic that if we did not do this, then the scale of human suffering that would be due to the economy slowing down and being disrupted by the pandemic would be too onerous to even contemplate. And so it was justified, it was logical for the government to invest resources to make sure that the most vulnerable among us continued to receive the cash flows that they needed. And this is not entirely philanthropic. A good friend of mine who farms in both Canada and the United States informed me when I was talking about this online that in Canada, they realized that this is a national decision, and that in 2015, they made their decision about the values that they have about protecting the most vulnerable in society. So in Canada, since 2015, the most vulnerable families, the eligible families, received a benefit of $6,000 per child. And this is a social safety net that will begin to do the kind of job that I've just described needs to be done to effectively deal with hunger, as long as they're not dealing with root causes. In other words, not adequately taxing the very wealthy people that are amassing fortunes on the basis of exploiting other people in society. So I wanted to basically illustrate that we know how to do this, and that in emergency situations, we do this. So how is it that in, quote, normal times, we abide 10 to 12% hunger rates, and we don't consider that that is an emergency situation? So that is a shift in our thinking. And if you are thinking to yourself, well, those Canadians and Europeans, they just live in a completely different reality. If you were paying attention, you realize that in last November's elections, the state of Maine became the first state in the United States to pass their own right to food legislation. So everything that you saw in the United Nations Declaration of the Human Right to Food is embodied in the amendment, the constitutional amendment that voters in Maine have passed. So I'll repeat, We know how to do this. We know what it takes in order to do this. Now, how would we do this? Well, it turns out we already have a pretty good start on how to do this. You know that the food safety net in the United States, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, has 3 different tiers of support. I'm showing the lowest tier here. That's called the Thrifty Food Plan. The name is a little bit misleading because it is calculated so that it actually supplies the necessary nutrition that the reference family that I described earlier should have. If you're eligible for SNAP benefits, many of you may be quite familiar with this, then the Thrifty Food Plan guarantees that you have 70% of those costs. So in other words, they guarantee you the full cost of the Thrifty Food Plan minus 30% of your net income. So we already have the elements of doing this. And furthermore, they deal with several of the other objectives that I showed you at the very beginning, and that they actually aim to support a healthy, active lifestyle by relying on what we know is healthy food. We don't need to ask ourselves what that food is. That actually is documented by the government itself. And as you all know, it's embodied in the dietary guideline recommendations that are known for public purposes as Choose My Plate, which represent primarily a plant-based diet. The significance of that in terms of being able to achieve all of the goals that I described to you at the top of the hour will become clearer in about 10 minutes here. So let's go now to the need to produce all this food in regional food webs. The pandemic essentially has been the object lesson in this. So rather than depending on whether the Port of Los Angeles is open and receiving the flux of imported food that comes through there, and then that food is adequately being distributed through a very narrow set of channels to the rest of the nation, or rather than depending on the upper Midwest to be the source of the majority of the meat that is produced in the nation and again distributed at a distance, we have the capacity, I'll show you in just a moment the data for this, to produce a whole lot more on a regional basis. And this would be much better for the resilience of the entire food system, but also for the nation's entire economy as well as regional economies. I'm showing you here several different analyses that we've done at the Union of Concerned Scientists. The one that I'll highlight here just to make the point is one that we did for the state of Iowa, which is essentially a biological desert. It's a monocrop of corn and soybeans, very different from what you're familiar with in the state of California in terms of a single monocrop. Now, you have your own monocrops, but there's much more total diversity in terms of the number of crops, if not in terms of the systems that are used to produce those crops in the state of California. But in the state of Iowa, here's what we found. Essentially, if the state of Iowa procured its own food from farmers and ranchers in its own state that have the capacity to produce what all the institutions in Iowa are purchasing, this would be a $3 billion boon to the economy of the state. You can think of all of the knock-on effects that come from this. So if you're interested in that research, you will find it on our website. I just want to make the point that there's an economic case for developing these more resilient regional markets, and that an object lesson of the pandemic is that this is actually in our national interest. There is a University of Illinois researcher who is specialized in studying the networks through which we distribute food. And just about a year and a half ago, soon after the pandemic started, she published a very timely article. Obviously, she had started doing this work before any of us had any idea that there would be a pandemic. But let me just tell you what her findings were. Her findings were that if you wanted to intentionally disrupt the flow of food in the United States, you really only needed to take about 3 or 4 steps that are easily within the reach of any terrorist. So first of all, you needed to bomb the Port of Los Angeles. Second of all, you need to bomb bridges on Highway 80, Interstate 80, throughout the central part of the United States. And third, you would need to bomb several different structures, essentially dikes and levees along the Mississippi River. If you did those three things, if you disrupted those three flows of food, the entire nation would be in a food crisis instantaneously. There would be less than about 8 days worth of buffer in terms of food actually in the local food system to deal with daily demand. So this is why regional capacity is important. Now, I talked about this concept of no hunger. We've talked now about healthy food. We've talked now about the importance of supporting regional webs of food production. But you know that there are many areas throughout the country that experience what can only be called realistically food apartheid. And that is the conscious decision of grocers who have a business model that, to just put it very succinctly, says unless we have at least a population of 50,000 people that are earning the median income, that community is not a community that warrants establishing a full service grocery store. So you get one of those for about every 50,000 of population earning the median income. So the economist John Eichard has proposed a way that we can deal with that. So how you would administrate the human right to food through existing programs that would expand on food safety net like SNAP would be through these community food utilities. It's the very same notion of rural water and rural electricity, where essentially it is inefficient to have companies in areas where you have low population density ostensibly competing to provide a service that's essential. And so instead, we set up public utilities that provide the same quality of service to everyone in those communities. So this is the idea. It's much more intricate, and this is not the place to go into the details. You can look up John Eichard's writings on this online. But essentially, this would be a vertically integrated structure that would work with farmers, that would work with processors and with marketers in order to make sure that nobody experienced hunger and that everybody had bountiful sales at the community level. So we can solve that problem as well. We have ideas about how to do that. Now let's talk about agroecological production. Again, the pandemic has been very illustrative here. I would say all phases of the pandemic, but particularly the last few weeks since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has unveiled a particular vulnerability, particularly on the part of countries that depend on Ukraine for their major staple, wheat. But also for seed oils that are important for foods in various different parts of the world. But these are primarily the countries of Northern Africa through Central and Southeastern Asia. These are countries where, if you'll remember the example of proportion of food costs that we talked about earlier, the average expenditure on food tends to be 30 to 50% of disposable income per household. So to all of a sudden be exposed to dramatic either shortages and increases in prices of food is going to lead to serious crises in those areas. Well, you know that one of the reasons why speculation has driven prices upward is that industrial agriculture, which is at the core of the production that you find throughout central southern Ukraine and the other 6 major industrial food basins of the planet, is that that's essentially embodied oil. The corn, the soybean, the wheat, the cotton, the sorghum, everything that is produced at large scale industrially is embodied oil. Embodied not just in the way that you're thinking, the fossil fuels and the energy embodied in the machinery and the chemicals that are used, it's in the fertilizers. Many of the folks that produce intensively in these settings can't imagine how you would maintain productivity levels unless you had those fertilizers. Now, if only there were people that had been working on how you can produce either depending less on fertilizers or without fertilizers at all. If only there were people who'd been working on that. Well, it turns out it's you and many other folks that have actually been preparing for situations like this that have that knowledge and that could develop further knowledge under agroecological systems. And so I want to walk you through a hierarchy of agroecology that was first defined by Steve Gleesman in order to tell you what we should do about this. Here you see the source of the publication where this concept was first articulated, but I'll just walk you through it very quickly. So the first level of agroecology, according to Gleesman and his colleagues, is basically the phase where you say, well, we need to be as efficient as possible in using these purchased inputs. After all, we're paying for them. If we don't use them efficiently, we're wasting that money. That's the phase which many call sustainable intensification. And industrial agriculture is at that stage. But a better stage is to think about ways in which you can replace those purchased inputs with essentially biological knowledge and with biological mechanisms. And so organic agriculture is a prime example of that. A third phase is where you rely on complex ecological interactions, biodiversity, in order to create better predator-prey interactions and better nutrient recycling, so that you have a system that by its very nature doesn't present the problems that conventional producers try to deal with all their purchased inputs. But in order to be able to do that, you need public support. Obviously, you need a public that's going to be paying you the cost of producing in the way that I've just described. And the ultimate would be that the entire nation recognizes that it's in the public interest to have those kinds of systems, and we invest in developing those kinds of systems. So at UCS, we've partnered with colleagues that have actually looked at how well we do on those criteria. So with Dr. Zalby Miles and Liz Carlisle, our research director, Marcia DeLange, actually analyzed the expenditures of the National Institute of Food and Agriculture at the USDA and asked how much of the grant dollars to the nation's land-grant universities support this kind of agroecological work. And what they found, to make a long story short, after a minutiae study of all of their grant making, and by the way, to their credit, with the full cooperation of NIFA at USDA, is summarized in this finding. So the nearly $300 million in grants that they took a look at in the year 2014, only about 4% supported that high level of agroecology that I just got through describing to you. So is there a runway for us to do better, for us to invest in a more resilient, more productive, more healthful system? Absolutely, there is runway. And remember, these are public dollars. You know, it isn't like we're asking people to invest their private earnings in a different type of agriculture. These are tax dollars that we're talking about. So I mentioned that I'd come back to this earlier on. And so here's the point. Currently, the way in which we spend public dollars to support agriculture represents a massive transfer of wealth, massive tax collection that's concentrated in very few corporations that actually benefit. Even the majority of farmers don't benefit. They just have money passing through them to the companies that sell them seeds, that sell them the machinery, that sell them the inputs. And this is particularly true in the commodity world. I know that there's glosses on that for those of you that produce fruit, vegetable, and do dairy. Now let's tackle one of the most difficult issues that I have proposed that we need to address in order to come up with the 21st century food system that we deserve and that we know how to put together. This is a system that is socially and racially equitable. Now, I'm just going to be blunt here. We don't have the time to beat around the bush. And I think that by this time in our collective experience in the United States, I should be able to just speak plainly about this issue, regardless of who you are. Now, let me explain just so that you understand. My mother's family produces dairy and farm supplies in San Luis Obispo, just north of San Luis Obispo. I understand that farm life. My dad's family are immigrant indigenous farmers from southern Mexico. They're mostly concentrated around Los Angeles, and they could very well work for people like my mother's family in agriculture. So I understand that. Here's the reason why I wanted to know that, so that you could hear what I'm about to say. The agricultural system in the United States is embodied racism. As you know, it is 97% white. And those 97% white people own 98% of the land in the United States. So what I mean by embodied racism is that this is not a division of land, a distribution of land that you would predict, no matter what tools you reach for. This is a socially engineered outcome of the way in which the nation was settled. This is what I mean by being direct. We just can't afford to beat around the bush. And since the racial reckoning that was prompted by the public and wanton lynching of George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis, we've all learned to be plain speaking about this topic. So the graph that you're seeing here is one that we developed last year in order to show how the holdings in agriculture are becoming whiter, if you can believe that. So the few people of color, Black farmers and other people of color that have held land are actually losing that land rather than gaining it. So it's not only an extant situation, it's getting worse. Now, how do you deal with this? Because obviously these are families that, you know, part of their identity is that they will brag on you that they are the X generation of farmers on their particular land. They're not the people that appropriated that land, but they're the people that are benefiting from what their ancestors did, say in the Midwest 6 or 7 generations ago, that's what they brag about, or up in the Northeast 10 to 12 generations ago, that's what they brag about. So let me quote to you from the paragon of modern capitalist thinking, Adam Smith, who in book 3, chapter 2 of The Wealth of Nations expressed this idea. Every successive generation of men, sadly, he did mean men, he wasn't thinking of anyone else, have an equal right to the earth and to all that it possesses. Now, let me translate this a little bit. He essentially was saying, no one deserves to own land in perpetuity, much less to bequeath it to their children. Now, Thomas Jefferson was even clearer about this just a few years after 1776. Do you remember? It's an easy date to remember. That's when The Wealth of Nations was published. A few years later, in 1790, Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison and said this: the earth should belong only to the living generation, who ought to hold it in usufruct. That means in use. Every kind of regime, law, and debt should expire each generation, which, by the way, at his time, he calculated at 19 years. Thus renewing the human lease on the common treasury of the earth. So, to put it plainly here, both Adam Smith and Thomas Jefferson did not believe that because you own land, it meant that your family was going to own that land forever. Because that is the lock on generational wealth that actually needs to be broken if we expect to see a more socially and racially equitable agricultural system. So let's iterate on this. Let me show you what could be. And in order to do that, I'm going to tell you about another piece of recent research that was conducted at Tufts by Julie Kurtz. You can find this paper online if you're interested in seeing the details. I'm going to march through it relatively quickly, but essentially what Julie asked for her master's degree was, how reasonable is it to expect that if we assumed a closed food system in the United States, and there was no imports, that we would be able to feed ourselves? Now, you're experts in food. You know that the answer to that question depends on, well, how many of us are there and what are we eating? So that's exactly the study that she did. So she looked at 378 metropolitan statistical reporting districts in the United States. And then she assumed that we're not going to make everyone conform to any particular diet. So she compared what we actually eat right now and calculated the footprint of that. Then what that footprint would look like if we ate according to what the USDA recommends that we should be eating. And then a number of permutations on less intensive diets, from 80% meat, 50% meat, 20% meat, compared to what we currently consume. And then a completely ovo-lacto vegetarian diet, and then ultimately a vegan diet. 7 different dietary regimes. So with that context, let me show you what she found. So the food that we would eat would essentially be produced on cropland. And if you eat meat, it would involve grazing land. And all of this would depend on essentially forest land, perennial vegetation. And so this could include also tree crops, nuts and so on, both for direct consumption and for oils, because the diets that Julie worked with needed to meet USDA nutritional guidelines, all of them. So take a look at the key down at the bottom left. You'll see that what that describes is essentially the ratio of the footprint. So red means a very large footprint. So you're not surprised when you observed that for essentially the baseline, so this is the way that we all currently eat right now, the highest population density areas of the country are the ones that have the largest footprints. I know you're looking down at Southern California, there are places that have a very low capacity to produce all of the food that would be required for the people that live there. So, you know, very dry desert area. So the greener the legend is, those different 378 metropolitan reporting districts, then the smaller the footprint is. Okay, so you've got that. So now let's march through the different dietary regimes. Here's the positive control diet. This means if we all ate according to what the USDA recommends. Notice how the footprint decreased up in the Northeast and down in the Southeast. Take a look at the 80% omnivore diet. Here's the 50% omnivore diet. There's a 20% omnivore diet. Notice how things are getting vastly greener the less meat intensive our diet is. And here's the vegan, the ovo lacto-vegetarian diet, and here's the vegan diet. So there are only a few places that would not be able to supply all of their food in a footprint radius less than 1,000 kilometers from where they are. It shouldn't surprise you that the upper Northeast is one of those areas, and that there are very high population density counties down in South Florida. So now let's take a look at what Julie found for grazing land. So obviously this only applies to people that are eating meat, but look at all those red splotches up in the Northeast, high population density. There's the positive control diet. There's the 80% omnivore diet, the 50% omnivore, 20% omnivore. Here's the perennial cropland. That's the baseline diet. That's the positive control. That's the 80% omnivore, 50%, 20%. 20% omnivore, the entire nation could do that. And here's the ovo-lacto-vegetarian diet, which it turned out to be exactly the same as a completely vegan diet. So now, the object lesson here is not we should all become advocates for everyone being ovo-lacto-vegetarian or vegan, but it does illustrate a few things. First of all, we do have the capacity to produce regionally. Now, if we put all of this together with data that I'm going to show you, you can imagine a completely different structure of our food system. And it deals with a lot of the things that I've just been describing to you. Here's a conceptual map of how we utilize land in the United States. Now, it's not a geographical map, it's conceptual, because what the authors of this map did, so these are geographers and cartographers working together based on government data, who did this on contract for Bloomberg News, who asked the question, how do we use our land? So essentially you see here represented in blocks of different colors, the major land use categories. But I can summarize this for you because that's a lot for you to digest, particularly in this setting. So essentially about half of the land in the continental United States is used for agricultural purposes. So it's this swath of land. And you notice about half of that is used for cows, pasture range, for horses, for sheep and goats, and also the very small footprint that farmsteads themselves account for. But you notice the vast majority of that is the print that is due to pastures and ranges in order to support livestock, primarily cows. Now, when you take a look at the food that we actually eat, that is 20% of the actual agricultural land. And if you follow the proportions that I just described to you, that's 10% of the land in the continental United States. Now, you may be thinking, but aren't we hearing that we really need to increase production because of the fact that, you know, there are hungry people on the planet, we need to ramp up production. Well, we're so wealthy in this nation that we can afford to waste about 50% of the land in producing beef. And then once food gets into our kitchens, waste about 30 to 40% of that. So yeah, if you want to promote global food systems that waste half of their land in producing, you know, biofuels and feed for livestock, and then waste 40% of that food once it gets into your home, yeah, we need to produce more because we're wasteful. But you can see that there's other ways of solving the conundrum. We can produce food better and distribute it in a completely different way. As you carefully observed in the diagrams from Julie's study, we can do this through a system of urban, peri-urban, and exurban regional food systems that are located exactly where the eaters are. This will allow us to crack the code of who's farming and allow completely different sets of people with completely different objectives and different ideas about what they want to produce and who they want to produce it for. And the nation can thrive with that kind of food system. If you'll recall the data that I showed you about our studies about the benefit of regional production and distribution. So hopefully you see that all of these things working together actually operate in order to produce the system that I've been aiming for. Now, if we go back to this, this is worthwhile taking a look a second time. Let me repeat, half of the continental land in the United States is used for agricultural purposes, and half of that is utilized for livestock agriculture, and only 10% of the nation's land is used for food that we eat. So if we did restructure the system in the way that I described to you, then we can deal with the climate issue. Keeping the large-scale intensive fossil fuel embodying, greenhouse gas emitting, beef producing, methane generating, nitrogenous fertilizer, nitrous oxide greenhouse gas producing agricultural system in place, and then thinking we're going to make it better by throwing a few cover crops in between the rows here and there is not really going to do anything permanent or effective. Instead, if we want to absorb carbon and we need for it to stay sequestered permanently, you all know that we need perennial vegetation. So you can imagine a lot of the land that we currently do not use for food production can go into perennial vegetation, either into tree crops for food or into actual perennial vegetation that to a lot of folks would be considered rewilding. Now, you may think, isn't this going to displace farmers throughout the nation? And let me just share with you that a lot of farm families, as you know full well, this may actually describe kitchen table conversations in your place, actually trying to solve the problem of farm succession right now, because this industrial food system is so exploitative that you cannot earn a living doing it. You have to earn your living doing something else and farm on the side for clearly at least 70% of farm families in the United States. That's what the USDA statistics show. So since the US government played a large hand in determining who will have that land by, first of all, committing genocide, grabbing the land, and then redistributing it to that population of 97% white families that have held that land to the present, the US government has a logical role to play in purchasing that land at fair market value and returning it to its original vegetation. You can see patches here and there of perennial crops, either tree crops or maybe some of the stuff that folks at the Land Institute are developing, perennial grains, fashioned after the natural example in the plains. But you can see the potential in places like California, highly population dense areas in the Northeast, for a completely different food system with different people participating and genuinely being able to meet our food needs. Now, ultimately, it's quite a luxury to say, let's rewild a lot of the land that we currently have in wasteful agricultural production, and it will be good for the climate. It will do that for sure. But the reason why it's a little bit of a luxury and very cavalier is that that was land that we've appropriated. And the descendants of the people that we impoverished and immiserated are here. So here you see the few relics of land that we thought to be the least desirable and the least productive at the time that this massive displacement took place, not so long ago, still in the 19th century. And then you see the federal lands that were appropriated, where a lot of those rangelands and cattle production are actually located. And then all of the odd polygons that you see are the federal treaty territories, territories that the government actually negotiated for in order to remove Native peoples. So rather than just say, let's rewild this land, this is the time to say, let's give the land back. And those folks should make decisions about how they want to use that land. Now, if you think that this is veering off into the realm of fantasy, let me tell you about one project that we are involved with here at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and this involves the Iowa Band of natives who refer to them in the full name, the Iowa Band of Kansas and Nebraska. That name tells you these were Iowa people that were displaced from Iowa, to the neighboring states of Kansas and Nebraska, and there they are. They were recently rematriated land by the Nature Conservancy. And we're working with them because their idea of what they want to do that land was to return it to the native vegetation that their ancestors knew how to use. They knew how to forage in an agroforestry system. That's what we would call it today. And so this is land that was not arable. That's one of the reasons why it was available to be able to return to them. That's another story. But they want to return it to an agroforestry system that they can use in lots of different ways. One is basically it returns to what it was, so it's cultural heritage for them. But secondly, it's sustenance. They plan to forage in that land. And then thirdly, they're living in the 21st century. This can be revenue generating for them because they live within driving distance of Lincoln, Des Moines, Kansas City, where people might want to go bathe in nature, as the Japanese say. And so, they can guide people on guided tours that are accustomed to living in the biological deserts that we've created in the modern states of Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. So these folks, given sovereignty over their land, again, would make decisions like this, and it's their entire prerogative what decisions they would make, but this would be restorative justice. In my mind, all of these things fit together. Now, I told you that I would conclude this by telling you the failed premise of public support for the system that we have right now. The failed premise is that we are investing in the agribusiness sector because it generates jobs and it provides a reliable source of food for all of us. And we're doing this to support a market system where, according to the theory of the market, if buyers and sellers are operating in an environment where they can make what economists call rational choices, in other words, buyers are looking for low cost and sellers are trying for the highest cost, the highest price that they can earn. If everybody in a self-interested fashion is operating with full access to information, ostensibly everybody benefits in this kind of system. But instead, as you know, in the food system, the wealthier the agribusiness sector and the food system gets, the more profits they earn, as clearly illustrated during the pandemic, the more miserable workers are and the sicker as a population we all get. This is clearly a textbook case of market failure. The market is not working. We're throwing money away, investing and propping up a system that does more net harm than the trivial amounts of good that it does for a few very rich corporations. Now, let me put the cap on that. If we recognize that I'm talking here about public investment, and there are folks that want to continue to produce beef, a resource-intensive crop, or want to continue to produce corn for the export market or ethanol in intensive industrial ways, they ought to be free to do that. By all means, they ought to be free to do that. I just don't see that there's a straight-faced argument for why the public should be paying to support them. What we should be paying to support instead should look like this. So unless public investment can result in no hunger, a nourishing supply of food, resilient regional food webs, agroecological production, socially and racially equitable food systems, and climate positive systems, I don't see why there's a case for the public to be investing their tax dollars in supporting someone that says that they're in agriculture. So obviously, for all of this to cohere, we need to be at that highest level of the Weisman hierarchy of agroecology. Level 5, where essentially the society is committed to this kind of agricultural and food system. So there is something for the dreamers and the doers at EcoFarm to help me dream about and to help bring about. Thank you very much, Andy. I'll turn this back to you.
Wow, thank you, Ricardo. That was incredibly powerful, and your ability to weave together so many disparate themes into a coherent whole on the direction we all need to take is amazing. I'm awed. So I wish we had time for questions. We really don't. So I think we're going to let the session go, and we'll get, if anybody's interested, we can get Ricardo's contact information to them. And again, just my deep appreciation for a fantastic speech. Thank you.
Thank you all.